Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland and I'm showing you G Wodehouse's house in London on Dunraven Street without blue plaque. I'm not sure if he owned the whole of it. He was doing very well if he did, but he was quite a wealthy man towards the end of his life. So Pelham Grenville Wodehouse was born at Guildford. That's a little bit outside London to the southwest in the county of Surrey. So G Wodehouse, he loathed his name. They abbreviated Pelham to Plum for pronunciation. That's what he was to his friends, Plum. So his father was a judge in Hong Kong. G Wodehouse had two elder brothers, and when he was little they set sail to Hong Kong again. His family had been home on leave when he was born, and he spent his toddlerhood in that British colony on the southern coast of China. Anyway, he was rapidly dispatched back to the United Kingdom to be looked after by nannies and an aunt. So he didn't see his parents again for several years, and he never developed a close attachment to them. Seemed not to be terribly close to his brothers either. Anyway, G Wodehouse, he went to a number of boarding schools. He loathed his prep school. Then he went to Dulwich College, which is in London, well south of the Thames. The only other famous boy from Dulwich College is the Honourable Saint Nigel Farage. Okay, he's not honourable. But anyway, so he absolutely adored Dulwich College and remained dedicated to it for the remainder of his life. So that was remain twice in one sentence, wasn't it? Overdoing it, he wouldn't have made such a mistake for the rest of his life. Anyway, so he was fairly academic, he was a gifted athlete, he had a fine singing voice, he could play a few musical instruments, and he was delighted to publish articles in the Alanian, which was the school magazine. And so he seemed destined for university. And of course, this being a time when only perhaps 2% of people went to university. But then disaster struck when his father, who'd retired, having his pension paid in Indian rupees, couldn't afford it because the rupee had fallen in value against the pound, and G Wodehouse wasn't bright enough to get a scholarship. There were other universities to go to, doesn't seem to be considered that. Those were rather cheaper, and there were things, there were ways to study night courses. But anyway, he got a job at the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation as HSBC to you and me, which he found really tedious and did for several years. So he was a bit of an escapist. And in his unhappy childhood, he'd invented this imaginary world for himself and all these fictitious characters, sometimes based on people he knew. And so he found banking baffling and banal, but he retreated into this fantasy world that somehow managed to hold down a job for quite a few years, began writing more and more, and getting published and making more money from that. He was eventually able to give up banking and go and become a full-time writer. So he wrote plays, he even wrote scripts for Hollywood, and by the 20s he was becoming quite well known. He luckily managed to avoid service in the First World War, which might have killed him. He was over 40, so just about old enough to say, oh, I can't be in the army. He got married and he had only one daughter, if I remember correctly. So I don't want to tell you about everything he wrote, because he wrote over 90 novels and published about 200 short stories, play scripts besides. But his most famous comic creation is Jeeves and Wooster. Bertie Wooster, Worcester not spelled like the town Worcester, is this a convivial but old Etonian who's rather short on the grey matter, who's swanning around London in the 1920s and one of the bright young things. And despite being an Oxford graduate, as I say, he's a dimwit. And so Jeeves, his butler, gets him out of a soup, as they were said many times. Excuse me. Have I got hay fever or something? There's an awful lot of pollen in the air. Dust getting in my eyes too. So, yeah, whereas Jeeves is very capable, or a man of capanosity, as Brendan Behan might have said, who's stern, very upright in every sense, clever, and even though he's supposedly subordinate, actually manages to control his supposed master. He's got plenty of money, Bertie Wooster, no need to work ever, and seems to be sort of asexual, has so-called girlfriends. He goes around with arm in arm, is not physically attracted to them, talks about getting engaged, but is really actually quite childlike. Got a good mark in religious knowledge, gets up to japes like before the university boat race, stealing a policeman's helmet, and then had up before the magistrate and sentenced to the harshest penalty that the judge could impose by law upon a man of his class, sentencing him to pay a fine of 3 shillings or something like that. Anyway, so P.G. Wodehouse wrote Right Ho Jeeves and other books like that. So he was rather wealthy by the 1930s, and 1934 he moved to France, lived at Le Touquet. That was to minimise his tax liability. And he was there. He decided not to flee when the Germans were advancing. He was interned as a civilian in 1940 and taken to Germany, put in Upper Silesia, where he wittily said, "If this is Upper Silesia, what must Lower Silesia be like?" He didn't like his internment over much. So whilst the United States was still neutral, P.G. Wodehouse was persuaded to make 6 broadcasts in the United States on apolitical topics. Might seem anodyne, but it went down very badly in the United Kingdom. People said it was traitorous. It wasn't prosecuted for that. He didn't return to the United Kingdom ever again. In 1947, he moved to the United States. He eventually acquired American citizenship, lived there to his death in 1975. He's buried in New York. Before he died, he began a correspondence with the teenage Stephen Fry. So anyway, read his stuff. It's an absolute howl. It's very witty. He bears his erudition lightly, I suppose, but between the lines you'll see allusions to all sorts of other novelists and to poets. The sentences are overly long, a bit clunky for my style, too overly punctuated. I would break up some of his sentences into 2 or even 3. So it's possible to sometimes lose the thread of what's happening, but other times even quite fast-paced. But he peppers it with the slang they had in the early 20th century, which is hardly comprehensible these days. Anyway, that's a little bit about P.G. Wodehouse. Toodaloo.